You hung with everybody for most of the day today. My name is Seemiller. I'm the Director of Leadership Programs at the University of Arizona, and I oversee a number of different leadership initiatives, credit-based and co-curricular programs.
And my name is Tom Murray. I'm a coordinator for leadership programs here. I work with the National Collegiate Leadership Conference as well as our Atlas Leadership Certificate program.
And Tom and I have been involved in an interesting journey that took place starting nearly 2 years ago when it came to learning outcomes. And I know for many of you, for some of you, this could be incredibly exciting. Like for me, I get excited about learning outcomes, and some other people think it's just kind of a means to an end. And it is a little bit of both. And so I want to share with you, we want to talk about our journey and kind of what you can do to maybe think about your learning outcomes and how you want to set those and measure those in effective and meaningful ways for you. We have a couple of leadership programs here. The Arizona Blue Chip program is probably one of our longest running leadership programs that we've had that we actually do assessment on. And for years we've actually been using the CAS standards and Learning Reconsidered, the document, to basically assess and evaluate our programs, and especially looking at things like student learning and their development as opposed to just the program evaluation. And the CAS was actually established in 1979, and what's interesting is that it published its first set of standards in 1986, which is fabulous, and I know many people use the CAS standards for lots of different program planning and basically kind of departmental evaluation. But it was actually designed to develop and assess programs, not individuals. And I think for Tom and I, this was a big kind of aha as we re-looked at this particular document and said, wait a minute, are we using the CAS standards to measure individual students' ability to do these things, or should we be looking programmatically at the aspects of CAS standards? We were also using Learning Reconsidered, which was created in 2004 as a collaboration between NASPA and ACPA, and it was also a fabulous guiding document for us, but it was designed to outline the desired outcomes for student learning across the entire collegiate experience. So great outcomes, really kind of looking at the student as a holistic kind of entity, and we were trying to think about, all right, how are we using this document to really capture the experiences that individual students are having in individual programs designed for leadership development. So they provided a really good first space for us, and so what we ended up doing with that is we looked at CAS and Learning Reconsidered, and we went through all of these standards and outcomes and said, okay, what is it that we really think that we're missing? So we went through and kind of compared them to some of the programs we already had developed, and we said, we really think we should be hitting on this standard or this outcome. And we used them to develop actually the Atlas Leadership Certificate program, which is a workshop series that students can engage in and take one workshop if they want, multiple workshops, or even in a track and receive a certificate. We did this previously as something called the Leadership Workshop Series, but it wasn't very strategic in terms of the outcomes we really wanted to hit on. So by actually looking at CAS and Learning Reconsidered, we were able to design a new program using some of those outcomes that we didn't have integrated into our other programs. We also basically use them to refine our existing programs. What are we and are we not doing in our other two big programs, the Blue Chip program and the NCLC conference? What is it that we want students to get out of it, and what is it that we're actually having students get out of it? We're two kind of different things. So we use CAS and Learning Reconsidered kind of in the essence of in which they were created, which was program planning and development. But what we then did is we attempted to assess students based on a 5-point Likert scale and using some qualitative measures that we developed based on the outcomes and the standards from CAS and Learning Reconsidered. This was our way of basically saying, how in the world are we going to be able to measure if a student is getting what we intended the program to be? So the question was, it was clunky. That's what it was. It was clunky. And the reason was because CAS and Learning Reconsidered were not meant to be developmental measurements. They were meant to be program planning outcomes. So what we saw, some of the things we noticed right away, was we saw a duplication across CAS and Learning Reconsidered. For instance, in the CAS standard, social responsibility had quite a bit of overlap with the humanitarianism principle in Learning Reconsidered. Both really important, but because they were two separate documents, they had a lot of overlap. Some subcomponents did not fit what we wanted to measure. Actually, in the CAS standards, there's one of the actual outcomes or the standards uses appropriate syntax. And I'm sure kind of in the large-scale collegiate experience, it probably is important that a student would use appropriate syntax. However, in our leadership programs, we knew that that was not something we were teaching, not something we were going to measure, and certainly probably not an outcome of any of our programs. So again, picking these up in their entirety seems like kind of an irrelevant fit for us. It also is missing some outcomes that we valued. Just as there was duplication of some of them, which kind of highlighted the essence and the importance of that particular standard or outcome, there was also some that were missing. For instance, effectively designing a vision, empowering others. Some of those pieces we felt were really valuable to our programs. We also kept in mind that neither were actually developed to measure students' leadership development. Again, they were program planning standards. And again, CAS are standards, Learning Reconsidered are outcomes, and were we clumping them all together into one concept? What was that concept, and how in the world were we actually trying to measure it?
So we decided that we wanted to use CAS and Learning Reconsidered as a jumping off point and creating our own list, our own document that we could then use to measure the leadership development of the students that we work with. And in doing so, we needed to ask ourselves a few questions. We needed to figure out, what is it that we want to have? Do we want to have standards? Do we want to have outcomes? Or do we want to have something completely different? We also needed to kind of do a chicken and the egg thing. You know, which comes first? Do we look at our programs to define our outcomes, or do we look at the outcomes that we want to then figure out what programs we should have? And we also needed to figure out how it is that we were going to measure them. So the first thing that we did is we figured out what we wanted to call them. We actually sat on the computer and looked up the definition of some of these words that we use every day, maybe not even understanding what they are. And a standard is something that is created by an authority, and most professions have standards that kind of dictate what professional behavior would be and what professional programs should be. We also looked at outcomes, and an outcome is something that you want to have at the end. So if you teach a class, you have a list of learning outcomes, hoping that your students at the end of that class will have achieved those things. But we also looked at this concept of competency, which really looks at knowledge, attitudes, and skills. And when we really thought about it, what we wanted to measure were competencies. We wanted to measure the knowledge, attitude, and skills that students were developing in our programs. We also realized that the impact of outcome on program or program on outcome is really bidirectional, and that both defines both. We looked at program elements that we clearly valued and defined competencies that we believed were important based on that. So, for example, our Equus Social Justice Retreat is a very large component of the Blue Chip program and is now its own standalone program. We clearly value social justice, and so we defined a competency of understanding issues of social injustice based on the fact that we clearly value social justice in our programs. Likewise with Myers-Briggs, we do the Myers-Briggs type indicator with all of our first-year students in Blue Chip. Clearly, we value students having an awareness of self, and so possesses an awareness of self became one of our competencies. But it also works the other way, and that we look at some competencies that we know we want our students to develop. We want students to develop positive and healthy relationships with others, and so we use that competency to make enhancements to our programs. And one that we did is adding leadership excursions to our conference so that our conference participants have more opportunity to network and have those social connections with other emerging leaders. We also value communication skills, and we want our students to be able to communicate. And we saw that there was kind of a gap in our Blue Chip program, that maybe our students were not developing that competency enough, and so we added a case competition to the program so that all of our students in that phase could develop that competency. We also took a look at how we planned to measure them. Corey mentioned that we were using a 5-point Likert scale to assess CAS and Learning Reconsidered measures. We actually changed that to a 4-point scale because we wanted to remove that neutral response option. We didn't want to have that kind of muddying up the waters. And the nothing, a little, some, or somewhat, and a lot are the ways that we define those 4 points on the Likert scale. We also knew it was going to be self-reported. We are not going to observe people communicating and assess their competencies. We are going to be asking them to report to us whether or not they have developed that competency. We knew it would be post-event. We have many events throughout the year, and we actually assess these competencies after each event so that we can disaggregate the competency development that we have from program to program. And we also knew that the quantitative measures would not be anonymous in every situation. For our courses for credit and for our conference, they are anonymous. We don't know who responds to what. But for Blue Chip and our Atlas program, we do know who it is that responded, and that does have some implication for the way that we ask questions. We also knew that we wanted to have some open-ended qualitative questions that we could get some narrative data. But the common thread with both of those is that we wanted it to be standardized. We wanted the question for a specific competency to be standard across programs. So if I'm measuring understands causes of social injustice, I'm going to use the same question whether it's EQUIS, whether it's our Atlas Social Justice programs, or whether it's our Social Justice Leadership course for credit.
So we began this journey, and we created something we call the SLCs, the Student Leadership Competencies. And this began in August 2008 when we were in the process of creating our post-event reflection and evaluation forms for each of our events for Blue Chip, when we kind of stumbled across the problematic piece of, again, trying to use CAS and Learning Reconsidered as individual assessments, and said we really need to look at this and do something and create our own list that makes sense for us. So what Tom and I did was we actually individually looked at CAS and Learning Reconsidered. We both took both documents, sat in our offices for several hours, and went through and said, what of these, if we were to turn them into individual developmental outcomes or competencies, what would be relevant for our programs? And we went through and kind of highlighted those. We both had our own process. And then we also created another list. What is missing? What is it that we do in our programs that we think we want to measure? And we both came together with these two lists. And what we did is we actually compared lists. And many of the items on our two lists overlapped. And then we had some that the other hadn't thought of, which was really great because it made sure that we filled in some of the gaps to create a much more comprehensive list than either one of us would have done individually. So what we did is we sat down and we used our list to come together and make version 1.0 of the SLCs. What we did with that is we ended up with 18 different clusters, so kind of headers of general kind of topic areas. And then underneath of those, there were between 1 and 7 specific competencies for each cluster. Now you'll see kind of the fact that there was one competency under a cluster and kind of how we addressed that later on. But we had these 18 clusters, and when you totaled it up, it was 60 specific competencies that we wanted to measure. So after that, what we did naturally is we created the assessment measures for each competency. So we said, okay, we wanted this 4-point Likert scale. We knew kind of generally how we wanted this done, but how in the world were we going to word it to make sense and actually measure what we wanted? So the question is to us, does it measure what we want? So after we would create some form of a competency question in terms of assessment, we would actually say, does it measure what we want? And a lot of them didn't. A lot of them we were just putting together lots of words and said, this sounds great. And then when we said, is it really causality? Is that really included? We could look back and say no. And this was a great process for us because we were able to really, really look at causality in terms of our measurements. Does it try to measure more than one thing? Many of our competencies actually tried to measure more than one thing, and one of our examples was respect self and others. Okay, well, you might respect yourself, but you might not respect other people. And so we had to start looking at all the times that we had clustered these kinds of ands in our competencies so that we weren't trying to measure more than one thing. Do we want to measure it? On our 1.0, our version 1.0, the first thing, we have a cluster titled Academic Success. And so we had to ask ourselves, do we want to measure academic success? And we'll talk a little bit later about kind of where we landed on that particular cluster. What scale works best? And we already agreed that we were going to move from a 5-point to a 4-point Likert. And this was because it was self-reported. And so the idea was if it was worded that participating in this event had contributed nothing to my development of my oral communication, in essence, that really is neutral because it contributed nothing. So we're asking them, did participating in a particular event or experience enhance or contribute to the development of a particular piece of knowledge or an attitude or a skill. And either it didn't at all, which would be nothing, or it did a little bit, or it did somewhat, or a lot. Now, the big question is, how in the world can you quantify or really keep consistent words like nothing, a little, somewhat, and a lot? Well, the bottom line is, you know, that is a limitation, but if the same person is answering 5 or 6 questions, their version of a little means the same thing between question 1, question 2, question 3, and question 4. So when we're doing some averages and we're looking at comparison, we're going to be able to take that into account. Now again, if someone says a little and it's in their mind as a little, that's still important for us to know, because if we want to get that person to somewhat or a lot, it means in the end we still need to do something more. And that is a significant indicator for us in the design of these questions. So what we did in August 2008 through May 2009 was we basically ended up piloting this first version in the Blue Chip program, Atlas, the National Collegiate Leadership Conference, our courses for credit, and EQUIS. And so what we were able to do was create, again, like Tom had mentioned, the same exact kind of questions or the standards for the assessment, and use the same ones across programs. So it might have been participating in the social justice course increased my knowledge of social injustice, or it could have been participating in the EQUIS social justice retreat, and so forth. And so what we could do is see if any of our programs were garnering greater returns in terms of development and increase of knowledge, attitude, and skill between programs. So what we did then in December of 2008 is we actually went to the Leadership Educators Institute and we presented this, and we did a workshop on creating competencies and standards and outcomes on your own campus, and we were able to get some feedback on ours, which was really helpful. We also were able to run the first semester data of our programs to that point and be able to start looking at what are some of the findings that we have. Well, what was interesting about that is we started to notice some of the anomalies in the findings, thinking, wow, I really thought that we did do this really well in this program. I wonder why people are ranking it as nothing or a little. That seems really weird, because especially in their open-ended responses, they're saying that they learned it. So it must be the design of the question. So we were able to kind of go back and look at some of these quantitative assessment measures and say, all right, does it measure what we want? So here's a good example. We had one that was possesses administrative skills. Well, Tom and I had our own version in our minds of what administrative skills meant. It meant somehow sitting in an office, probably filing some papers, probably being able to kind of, you know, organize yourself in ways that are productive. Okay, but we didn't say that. So we said possessive administrative skills. So that could be a number of things. It was just way too vague. So when our students were saying that they weren't gaining anything in this, we thought that's strange, because we definitely think we're developing this. So we actually changed it to organizes materials in an effective manner. So when we talk about materials, it could be either electronic materials, it could be paper materials, but the idea was that the skill was organize. That was a big shift for us. The other thing we did was, does it try to measure more than one thing? I don't know how we managed to let a few slip through, but we did. We actually thought about this the first round, but we ended up looking at it again. We said, understands issues and causes of social injustice. Well, this is great, except that we realized issues and causes are not the same thing. So we ended up separating those into 2 separate competencies. Then the other thing is, do we want to measure it? We actually had career development as a section, and we realized that we were not trying, career development is not a competency. There's nothing about a competency, a knowledge, attitude, or skill in career development. The knowledge, attitude, and skills were already covered in our other competencies. Being able to effectively research information, or effective oral communication, which might be helpful in an interview, or ability to interact with others effectively, which is networking. So those knowledge, attitude, and skills are already embedded in what we were doing, and career development just happened to be kind of the cluster in which we thought that they would do that in that context. So we took it out. We also had things around technology, uses technology efficiently, some version of that. Well, then we asked ourselves, what technology, and what technology do we even teach in our leadership programs that will be relevant kind of in a timeless sense? 5 years from now, is that technology going to be a competency, or is that just be something useful at the time they were in our programs? We also had practical life skills. What is that? And we kind of envisioned being able to change a tire or sew on a button that falls off your shirt. Like, these are really great kinds of life skills, but at the same time, we weren't teaching those specific skills. What we were really teaching was the critical thinking behind being able to engage in practical life skills.
So we got through our first year. We updated some of the SLCs in January. And then at the end of the 2008-2009 year, we decided to take this project and make it even bigger and try to think outside of our own program. We looked at CHIA, which is that Council for Higher Education Accreditation. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to see how cross-disciplinary leadership really is. We wanted to see the leadership competencies that these academic programs are supposed to be developing in their students. So at first we looked at about 12 professional accrediting organizations, and you might wonder why it is that we picked these 12. And the simple answer is because they were the first 12 listed alphabetically on the CHIA website. So we actually have more forthcoming. But looking at these accrediting organizations allowed us to see which of our leadership competencies were included, but it also allowed us to look for potential competencies that maybe we overlooked. And that is a two-part process. One is, okay, well, what do pharmacy academic programs have in common with our SLCs so that we can go to our pharmacy school and say, hey, leadership development is important for you, and this is how we can partner with you. But we also wanted to see, well, maybe pharmacy has some leadership competencies in their outcomes that we perhaps overlooked. And after doing that, we created version 1.1 of the SLCs. We added some, we took some away, we reorganized them from 18 to 11 clusters. So the number of clusters went down, but you'll see the number of specific competencies went up. We went from 60 competencies to 71. Part of that is because we found some new competencies in those accrediting organizations. Some of it is because we actually had to split some of our own competencies because, as Corey mentioned, we were trying to measure two things at once. So we had version 1.1. And then what we did is we decided, well, we need to figure out a way to measure these really consistently. And the first step to doing that was determining, what are we measuring? Are we measuring a skill? Are we measuring knowledge? Are we measuring an attitude? Some of the things we realized, we don't want our students to do this. We want our students to value this, or we want our students to understand how to do this. And we wanted to be very clear about what it is that we were measuring so that we could create that consistent language with our measurements so that every competency that is based on knowledge is going to have in the verbiage of the question increased understanding. Every attitude competency is going to have, this program encouraged me to, and every skill competency is going to have the language, increased my ability to, so that we could really be consistent not only across our programs, but we could be consistent within our competencies themselves. This year, we are piloting version 1.1 with our programs again, using a lot of the same methodologies as before, but with these even more consistent questions. But we're still not done. We are still in progress. We have about 30 more accrediting organizations to go for version 2.0. And when I say about 30 more organizations, I really mean about 50 more organizations, because a lot of these organizations have multiple sub-organizations within them. So we do have quite a few academic programs that we're looking at, including things like dance, forestry even. We have mortuary science in our list. Some things that we don't even have here at the University of Arizona, but we want to be able to look at them so that we can show that leadership development shows up across disciplines. And then forthcoming, when we're done with all of that, looking at all of these accrediting organizations, we plan to create a searchable database so that we internally, but then other people at our university, potentially outside of our university, can search. Well, I want to know what disciplines require understanding causes of social injustice, and search by that competency and see a list of disciplines that require that. But then also the other way, I want to be able to look up, okay, well, I'm a director of a mortuary science program. I want to know the leadership skills that I am expected to teach my students.
So as you can see, here are the clusters for 1.1. They will be changing a little bit based on some of our research that we've done on the more recent accrediting organizations. But these are them right there. Now these clusters themselves are just simply headers. They are not anything in which someone would evaluate their own progress in. But underneath them are the 71 individual competencies. And you'll see a website at the bottom there. We actually have all of the clusters with all of the competencies listed on this website, and we also have the measurements for all of these on there. And when we have version 2.0, that will go up there as well. But we really want this process to be able to help other people in terms of what might be some of the stumbling blocks or things to look out for when you're setting your own outcomes or standards or competencies or whatever it is you find most useful, but also that the outcome is here too. So for those of you who want a place to start, feel free to start with the student leadership competencies and be able to use those and go off of those, amend them and change them, or use them straight out of the SLC list, and then you have the measurements that are attached right to them. We've actually also offered for people to maybe cross-assess, or we can benchmark, with some of the same assessment measures and to see kind of how our students are developing. But we really think that this has both been a process and an outcome that we can share with people, and really wanted to make that available. So here are some of our just kind of final parting thoughts on this is, start somewhere. You may have your own set of outcomes that have been created already for programs. You may be starting from scratch. But if you either way, feel free to start with things like CAS standards and Learning Reconsidered and other kinds of useful documents in the field. You might also want to think about using leadership models. You can, starting with the relational leadership model or social change, those sometimes provide guiding outcomes as a good way to start. You can also, like I said, feel free to use the student leadership competencies that we have. Compare to your existing and future programs. So what is it that you're doing? How can you reflect those in your competencies or outcomes? And then what is it that you want people to achieve but might not be doing in your programs, or have a program that addresses that? And then tailor them. Tailor them. What are some of those things that are hopeful outcomes that you have, and what are some of those things that you definitely know that you're doing? Create a methodology to implement the measurements. Sometimes it's just simply feasibility. Like, we know that we have hundreds and hundreds of students that we serve, and we can't possibly be doing observations and interviews, and do what you can. And so we decided to do a post-event reflection. You can choose to do pre-post. You might actually choose to implement a number of different measures. But we kind of landed on the post-event because we knew that it was feasible, and we did the best that we could in terms of using that methodology. Use existing assessment measurements, or create your own. So like I said, if you want to use student leadership competencies measurements, feel free to use those. Create your own, or think about how you would create, you may have the ability to do interviews or focus groups, and think about the kinds of questions and really running yourself through that. Is it measuring more than one thing? Is there causality? And those kinds of things to help you make sure that you're actually spending your time and energy measuring what it is you intend to measure. And then pilot it, but be open to change. What we did is, even though mid-year last year it was incredibly frustrating for Tom and I to know that we had some changes we wanted to make on our student leadership competencies midway. However, we were assessing year-long leadership programs. So what we ended up doing is just letting it go, because the only way we were going to get effective data was to be able to let the whole process see itself through. And so we piloted for the entire year, like we said we were, just to also reconfirm in May that we really did want to make the changes we decided in December and January. And so then we were able to do another round of piloting this year. And again, we have a few changes that we have, and we have let kind of the horse sit midstream here and are letting it go until May. And so pilot, but be open to change and thinking about how are you going to make this better and better. If you change it and overhaul it so much, though, you're going to have a hard time kind of benchmarking from year to year. So you probably want to get close enough to what you feel like is a good, solid, fundamental, finality of it before you spend the entire effort of implementing it into all of your programs. But this is just a little bit of learning from us, and we've left a little bit of time on the clock here to be able to answer your questions and be able to help you through either the process or even just kind of the outcome of what it means to set and measure learning outcomes.
Thank you, Corey. Everyone can take a deep breath after the assessment questions there. If you joined us late, you can ask questions on the box if you see a question or a chat thing. The chat works a little bit better. But either way, you can ask the question there. Or if you're on Twitter, you can type and a question on Twitter, and just do the hashtag or # break drink. I think Gary already has a couple of questions coming from Twitter.
Yeah, I have a couple via Twitter. The first one is from Cindy Kane, and the question is, do other departments share these leadership competencies, i.e. Res Life with RAs, student activities with SGA, et cetera?
These competencies, we actually have started to pilot them within leadership programs. Residence Life has a copy of version 1.1 that they were trying to implement. And so we haven't worked with them on this next round of the versions. But our Center for Student Involvement and Leadership houses all of our fraternities and sororities and now our student government and our clubs and organizations. And so we are actually have been working with, and we've actually trained some of the folks here in our office to be able to implement and use these outcomes. Are they being used consistently? No. And I think that part of that is not that they're using other things, they're just not using outcomes, period, in some cases. And so our push is after this next version is to implement it in an institutionalized way across all of our kind of student activities and our fraternities and sororities and student government, and then start partnering with other campus departments who use outcomes. And Residence Life would be the first one that comes to my mind, as well as some of our cultural centers.
Okay. And then another one from Grace Fama. How do you get other student affairs staff to buy into the idea of learning competencies? I find that some are not into it.
I would agree. I also find that some are not into it. I think, first and foremost, we created these competencies for ourselves, for our programs, so that we know that we are delivering high-quality leadership development programs. If we're able to do that, everything else is kind of gravy. It's great if we can convince other departments that these are important competencies, that they should use them. But when it comes down to it, we actually did this for ourselves in our own program. So I'm actually less interested in getting other people on campus to use them than to use them to show the effectiveness of my programs.
Okay, we got another one from Twitter, and it's from Student Life Guru. And it's, how do you coordinate with academics, or do you coordinate with academics so that they're not over-assessing students? Students can get survey fatigue.
Well, we do coordinate with academic affairs for our courses for credit, but not so much for our assessment. What we do to make sure that we're not over-assessing students is, a lot of our programs are like MCLC is a one-time program, so it's kind of hard to over-assess them. But for things like Blue Chip and Atlas that have sequential programs, it's actually built into the students' completion requirements. So they might get tired of it, yes, but we have a structure in place to make sure that even if they are getting tired of it, they're still doing it. So we actually have very high return rate and response rate for our assessments because we have a structure built in that more or less requires it. And basically, it's an attendance measure in many of our programs. So even if you came to the event, if you don't do your event form afterwards, you don't get credit for coming. And so that's part of the mechanism in which they have to reply or fill that form out. And these are really brief. I know that sometimes students get involved in assessments that are very lengthy. After an hour-long program, it might take you 5 minutes tops to fill out these assessments.
All right, thanks. And then Jeff, I don't know if you have any other questions.
Yeah, I know you started with 60 competencies, and was it 71? That's what you have now?
Yes.
How do you track that per student? Is the goal to have a student hit all 71 competencies over the course of 4 years, or so how do you, from a kind of practical day-to-day aspect, manage that or work with that? I think what's been significant about that magical number of 71
is really kind of looking at it programmatically. So for instance, for a program such as Blue Chip, where they're in it for 4 years and there's tons of different events and experiences that they have, it should be feasible for us to integrate 71 across this time span of 4 years for them. Now, for students to be able to do a 1-hour workshop and get 71 competencies, well, that's pretty amazing and not really realistic. So what we do is we look across the program itself. Same with like the National Collegiate Leadership Conference. We know it's a 3-day event. If we try to stagger it so that there are different competencies at different points of time, then we know that the students are at least being exposed to those things. Now, there are some competencies that are just going to be more destined for particular experiences that aren't going to fit with other experiences, and that's also part of the discretionary kind of planning of these programs. But some of the bigger programs, it isn't unlikely for a student to be able to be exposed to the potential of developing all 71 of those competencies across their time in the program.
Following up on that, Jeff, another great way that we're able to use these is we're then able to use them to help individual students and help departments who are collaborating with us to select the program that fits their need best. For the Atlas Leadership Certificate program, we now have a self-directed leadership certificate, and the starting point for that is not for the participant to select the workshops they want to attend, but for them to go through the list of 71 competencies and determine, okay, well, these are the competencies I want to develop. And then our staff can say, okay, well, if you want to develop these competencies, these are the workshops that are going to do them. I mean, because let's be honest, I mean, a critical thinking workshop is, I mean, the title alone is going to indicate that probably not a lot of students are going to pick it. But if we can direct them to that workshop based on the competencies they want to develop, they're going to get a development experience that's much more aligned with their goals.
I have one more question. If you want to ask the question, you can send it in over Twitter with the BreakDrink hashtag, or just type it into the question box on here. Is how much data do you have, and are you just swimming in data constantly?
Well, in terms of the data that we actually collect from our event forms, we do we use the platform of OrgSync, and that's where we've been able to program our event forms in for many of our programs. And so as students fill that, it just kind of dumps into some databases for us, and which is very, very nice, and we can run some graphs and charts off of that pretty quickly. So it's a nice at-a-glance. We do have quite a bit of data because each event we actually basically have students fill out an event form for Blue Chip and for Atlas. But that's really good just for us to be able to have kind of on a long-term basis, and so we don't necessarily go through all of that and fish through every single piece of it after every event. But what we do is kind of at the end of the year, we're able to see and compare some of the findings from event to event within that year, and maybe an event to event from various years. So the past 2 years we've been able to be able to do that, to see what kinds of improvements we might want to have in the future about what our intentions were. So OrgSync has been able to help us with that. As far as our courses for credit and for NCLC, we actually have students fill out their assessment via paper. And so with that, it's actually, since those are kind of they're intensive, but they're kind of shorter term in terms of their completion of it, is we only ask a few questions. So we only post 2 or 3 or 4 measurements on there. So we don't have like 50 measurements we're trying to do for every program. We've really hand-selected those measurements that we feel are really important to those programs. So, for instance, we have a program in Blue Chip. It's a social justice retreat, and we actually offer it as a freestanding program as well. It's called Equus. And we went through, and basically out of the 71 competencies, we pretty much agreed that we do about 65 of them. Well, that's great, but we can't possibly measure 65 of them. It's too much data for us. It's too much data for the participants. So what we did is we said, what are those key pieces? Like clearly going to a retreat and having to be in discussion groups, you're going to increase your ability to effectively communicate orally. However, that isn't really the intention behind the retreat. That'll end up probably being a byproduct of it. So let's really concentrate on the heart and soul of what those competencies are. And once we narrowed it down so that we have 2 to 5 for different events, it's not overwhelming for the student in ways that it would be if we did all 65. And it's certainly not as overwhelming for us when we actually try to interpret the data.
And this a follow-up question is what is done with the data collected? Like how, I guess, once it's collected, what do you do with that data?
It depends on the program. We use it to change our programs. I have used it to make changes to workshop curriculum for Atlas because a certain workshop topic was not getting the responses that I wanted to. But we also use it for, information to give to others. So for the Parent and Family Association grant, when I do both my summary at the end of the year and then when I apply for new funding for the next year, I'm able to go to my NCLC data and say, this is a really effective program. 93% of the participants responded in this way, and that data, I think, is really compelling for people who are going to be giving us money.
We also use that data in our press releases, too, in our marketing of the events, because we can also make claims that participating in a certain event can increase your ability or your knowledge base or your values or attitude in certain competencies, because we have documented over the last event or two that it actually has. And so 82% of people who attended NCLC created a new relationship with someone else. So they met someone. So that's great. So 82%. So if you come to NCLC, you have a very good likelihood of meeting someone new, which if that's what you're interested in, this might be a really good fit for you to come and participate.
Great. Well, Corey and Tom, I think that's all the questions. Do you have any parting comments or contact information? Because I know people will watch this on video later. If they have questions, how can they contact you?
They can contact us by phone by calling the Center for Student Involvement and Leadership. The phone number is area code 520-621-8046. Also by email. My email is TAM, it's T as in Tom, A as in Apple, M as in Mary, @email.arizona.edu.
And one of the best places that you can actually get information is if you go to www.leadership-links.org. You're going to be able to find all the competencies on there, and then there's also information on how to contact us through there as well. We have a link there that will get you our phone and our emails as well. So please feel free to contact us if you have any questions about the process of creating outcomes, you have questions about our particular competencies. We're here to support you in this process.
Great. Thanks for attending and thanks for sharing.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.